The Many Adventures of Iron Dad and Spider-Son by LBIGreyhound13, Chapter 18, Kidnapped Part 4. As much as May, Pepper and Happy didn't want to be apart, they knew it was best to go back to their respective homes. It made sense. Neither of them had an extra guest room. There was only Peter's bedroom and the couch in May's apartment, and the guest room and the living room at the penthouse. It wouldn't be fair. Plus, Chief Harrison advised them to do so that if the kidnappers called either May or Pepper, they could answer the phones. Chief Harrison also had his colleagues monitoring the phones for that reason. Thankfully, Happy and Pepper gladly dropped May off as soon as they were done at the police station, promising to call in the morning. May tried to get some sleep, but it was too difficult. All she could do was think about Peter, not in his bedroom sleeping. How Tony was supposed to bring him home so that they could have dinner together. But that didn't happen. Tony and Peter were kidnapped and taken to who knows where, and for what reason, nobody knew. Tears formed in her eyes as she buried her head in her hands, sobbing. She prayed that this was all a bad dream, that she would wake up and Peter and Tony would come through the door and be perfectly safe. "Ben, please," she said quietly, looking up at her ceiling. "Please don't take Peter from me. He's all I have left. Please, just let him come home safely. Please." As soon as she said that, her phone rang, and May quickly picked it up, only to see that it was Pepper. She breathed a sigh of relief before answering. "Hey, Pepper," she said with tears in her eyes. "Hey, May," Pepper replied. "I'm betting that you couldn't sleep either." May exhaled as she ran her hand through her hair. "Not a wink," she said, tearing up even more. "I just kept. I don't want to miss the phone ringing, or Peter and Tony walking through the door." Pepper sighed shakily. "I know," she said. I was thinking the same." I can't lose him, Pepper," May said, looking at Peter's closed bedroom door. She had to close it once she got home. She couldn't stand to look in her nephew's empty bedroom, knowing that he was taken to God knew where. I can't. She sniffled. I know," Pepper said, eyeing the empty side of the bed she sat in, the very side Tony usually slept in. "May, I'm so sorry. I never should have made them go to that fucking gala. I should have." She began to cry. "I'm so sorry." Pepper, no," May said quietly but firmly. "You have nothing to be sorry for. This is not your fault. Whoever did this is to blame, not you. We have to keep faith that the police will find them. And Rhodey, too." Pepper sniffled and nodded. "Thank you," she said. I appreciate that." "You know, May said after a moment, when Tony was kidnapped in 08, I know you two weren't dating yet, but I could only imagine how you felt. Now that I'm dealing with it along with you, I hate how it feels." "Yeah, it was the worst feeling in the world," Pepper said, running a hand through her blonde hair. She chuckled. "Then it became a whirlwind of good and bad when he came home and threw himself into the superhero life." May nodded. She couldn't help but think back on Peter's journey into the superhero life. Her husband, Peter's Uncle Ben, was taken from them so cruelly. Peter blamed himself for what happened, and in doing so, he threw himself into the superhero life as well. She couldn't help but marvel at how very much alike Peter and Tony were. Perhaps that was why their relationship was so deep, so strong. "Between you and me," May said after a moment, "I sometimes wish that Peter would stop being Spider-Man and just live a nice, quiet life, you know?" Pepper chuckled, shaking her head. "Believe me," she said, I sometimes wish that too. For years I've tried to stop Tony, and I've failed every single time. It's just impossible, you know, to drag either of them away from it. May knew that Pepper was right. She knew from the moment Peter and Tony came clean about the former being Spider-Man that she never could convince her nephew to walk away from it. Not when it was one of the many things he and Tony had in common. She knew Peter needed Tony to guide him, and she would be forever grateful for that. Just as it's impossible to separate them, she said after a moment. I know Tony was protecting him, but there was no way Peter would let him go without a fight. I know, Pepper said, chuckling. Tony is the same with everyone he cares about, especially Peter. The brunette nodded in thought. They really do have a great relationship, she said, like we said last night. I think it might be deeper than we realise. Honestly, Pepper began, I think they may not even realise it yet either. It's just sort of happened. It's happening even now. May was about to answer when her phone rang again. Hang on a sec, Pep, May said, taking the phone away from her ear. She looked at the screen, and sure enough, it was Chief Harrison. Can I call you back? The Chief is calling me. He probably wants to follow up. Okay, Pepper said. Let me know what he says. Of course. I'll talk to you later, May said. Bye, Pepper replied. Bye, she said before switching it to the Chief's phone call. This is May Parker. Mrs. Parker, the Chief replied. It's Chief Harrison. I was wondering if I could stop by. I wanted to ask you some follow-up questions about Peter. Oh, of course, May said. Yes, please. Whatever you need me to do. Has there been anything new on the case? May asked as she followed the Chief to come in. Nothing as of yet, he replied, but we're doing everything we can. We're still looking at the footage and witness reports. Okay, May said as she walked them over to the table before they both sat down. You said you wanted to ask some follow-up questions. Yes, just to make sure we didn't miss anything, Harrison said as he took out his notebook. May nodded, giving the police chief the all-clear. First he asked her how to confirm how Peter spelled his name. And once May confirmed that, he moved on to the next questions. Date of birth is August 10th, 2001, correct? Yes, that is correct. Any nicknames he goes by? Sometimes Tony will call him Pete or Kid. That's it, really. Okay, Harrison replied as he wrote down her answers. He then went on to ask about Peter's description, what he looked like, and what he was wearing. She remained calm, keeping her tears at bay, as she continued to answer questions about her nephew. He asked her about his school, his social media, what Peter had on him aside from his phone, which they found in the alley alongside Tony's, hobbies, and if he had been missing before, to which she mentioned Washington, D.C. and the day of the ferry incident. So he went missing in Washington, D.C. on the day of the ferry incident? The Chief repeated. May sighed as she ran a hand through her hair. Yes, but, she began, it wasn't for too long. In D.C., his teacher, Mr. Harrington, told me that he was missing for 12 hours, give or take, and the day of the ferry incident, he missed out on most of the school day and came back later that day. Did he say why he went missing on those 2 days? Harrison asked. May knew the reasons why he was missing on those 2 days, but she couldn't let the police chief know that, not if she wanted to avoid revealing her nephew's alter ego. However, she also couldn't make it look like she was lying or putting Tony in a bad light. Well, you know, he never fully said why, May said after a moment. It's not that I didn't want to know. It's just, I thought he would come clean and explain why if I ever gave him space. But it never came up again. Since then, he's been more honest, more open. I would like to think that his internship helped him out in a way. The Chief nodded. He couldn't help but note how May paused before answering, if she knew why Peter had disappeared. But for now he would let it slide and focus on the task at hand.
Can you tell me what it was that Peter and Tony were working on during their lab days?
Normally, she would have panicked at that question, but thankfully she remained calm. She had to, for Peter and Tony. Not only that, but Tony and Pepper provided paperwork and a cover story to ensure that Peter's identity remained a secret.
Yes, May replied quickly. Tony mentors Spider-Man on the side, and Peter had a chance to speak to Spider-Man. So they often make his suits for him and suits for Tony and do upgrades and such. Peter loves it.
The chief nodded.
Okay. He said, now have you noticed anything off this past week with Peter? His moods, his eating habits? Has he seemed nervous or agitated?
May thought back on the past week, trying to see if there was something out of the ordinary with Peter. However, she couldn't think of anything that rubbed her the wrong way.
No, she replied. I can't think of anything. It was all so normal last week. We just did our thing, you know. I'm sorry. That's okay, the chief said. If anything comes up, just let me know. Now, I also have to ask this. Can you tell me what his schedule is like during the week?
Yes, May began before going over Peter's schedule with Harrison.
Okay, great, Harrison said as he closed his book. That should cover everything. Do you mind if I look around?
Not at all,
May said as the chief stood up and walked towards Peter's bedroom. What exactly are you looking for? Anything to rule out that this was a runaway case, Harrison replied as he studied the teen's bedroom.
As he looked around, he noted that it seemed like any other teenage boy's room, messy clothes and all. There was nothing to show that the teen was looking into getting something bad. He even noticed the pictures of him with his family and Tony. This was not a runaway case as he thought back on the video. After searching for a little longer, he finally decided to leave.
Everything looks clear. We're going to keep going forward and looking into all evidence. We'll let you know once we find something. Okay. Thank you, Chief Harrison, May said, nodding as she walked back to the door with him. Not a problem, he said as he moved towards the door and walked out. Give a shout if you need anything, or if anything comes up.
I will, thank you, she said again before closing the door after he walked out. Oh, Chief! Harrison stopped and turned around to look at May.
I know you may already know this, but... May began. Tony is a great man. He would never do anything to endanger Peter's life. And I know my nephew. They both really care about each other.
The chief smiled and nodded, before turning around to walk back out, leaving May alone. As soon as he was done with May, the next stop was Stark Tower, where he could find Happy Hogan and Pepper Potts. Since Happy was the last person to see Peter and Tony before they were taken, it was protocol to ask him some questions. From what the video showed, the men who grabbed Peter and Tony knew who they were, but evidence wasn't linked to Happy, May or Pepper. However, they needed to make sure, so he knew that Happy and Pepper thought so too. So, once he got to the tower that morning, he was signed in at the front desk and escorted to the penthouse, where Happy and Pepper greeted him. After talking for a few moments, Pepper left Harrison and Happy to talk alone.
Thank you for speaking with me, Mr. Hogan, Harrison said as they sat down at the table. Yeah, of course, Happy said. Anything to help Peter and Tony. So, since you were the last one to see Tony and Peter, Harrison continued, I wanted to see if you could take me back through the night. What was the plan for last night? Well, okay, Happy began. I drove Tony to May and Peter's apartment to pick up Peter. We got there early, so that Tony could help Peter with his tie at around 6, and we left at around 6:30. We got to the hotel around 7. The paparazzi were already there in front of the building, trying to get pictures. I asked if Tony needed me to come in with them, but he said I didn't need to, and asked me to come back to pick them up in 2 hours. I did, and that was when I saw you and your guys.
Harrison nodded.
Now, can you tell me about the security of these events? Yes, Happy replied. They always hire this one company to be security guards, a Citadel security agency. Sometimes, if politicians are there, their secret servants will be there, but not at this time.
So Tony didn't see the need for you to come?
Harrison stated, no, which, you know, happens. Happy replied. He couldn't help but wonder if maybe things would have turned out differently. If he had insisted on going in with Tony and Peter, would they still have been kidnapped? Could he have protected them? The chief nodded as he wrote in his notebook. Now, after you dropped them off, he began again. Where did you go? I parked the car in the parking garage, Happy said, and then I went to a Five Guys to get a burger, and waited there until it was time to pick them up. Then I got the car and drove back to the hotel. Harrison made a mental note to ask the guys to check the security cameras, and such to confirm that that was where Happy was. So far, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Okay, he replied, nodding. Now I must ask. How did Stark seem to you? Like, what was his mood? His demeanour? Did he say or do anything strange? Happy shook his head. No, he was completely fine. He replied, the whole day. He dreaded the gala. He always does when Pepper makes him go to these things. He hated the idea of dragging Peter to another one. But honestly, I think he was thrilled he and Peter were going to another one. Would there be another reason as to why he hated bringing Peter to another gala? Well, the first one Peter went to with Tony and Pepper, Happy said. I don't have all the details, but I know they ran into Norman Osborn. I think the arsehole said something that made Peter uncomfortable. What makes you think that? That's what Pepper told me that night. Also, when I was driving Peter and Tony to the gala last night, Happy replied, Tony was going over some ground rules with Peter. One of them was that they would steer clear of Osborn, and that if Peter felt a panic attack coming on, to give Tony a signal so that they could go somewhere private for the kid to calm down. Harrison nodded. Seems like Stark really looks out for Peter. He said, what did you mean last night when you said their relationship was rocky at first? Happy chuckled and at the same time mentally kicked himself. Nothing bad, he said. It's just... When Tony and Peter first met, Tony was also dealing with the drama with the Accords and Rogue Avengers, and Peter wanted to show Tony his potential. Tony tried to keep his distance, but found that he missed having the kid around, and started to open up around Peter. Since then, they've been the best of buddies. The chief nodded. Since Peter has encountered Osborn, he said, have there been any other rivals or enemies of Stark's that Peter may have spoken to? Happy thought for a moment and shook his head. Not that I can think of, he said. Most of Tony's enemies came and went before Peter came into Tony's life, especially this one guy who was an absolute lunatic. But he was fired last year before the whole Accords thing, and Peter wouldn't even know who he was. Okay, well, even so, Harrison said as he leaned back in his seat. I'm going to need that list from Miss Potts. This way we can start looking into suspects. Absolutely, Happy said. Friday, can you tell Pepper? I will pass the message along, Mr. Hogan, Friday replied. Within minutes, Pepper came out of the office carrying a piece of paper. Sorry about that, she said. I wanted to make sure I got everyone. Not a problem, Miss Potts, Harrison said as he stood up. I wrote down former employees and their last known addresses, Pepper said. I also included enemies who are in prison, but I don't know how much help that is. I thought I would be writing a novel. It's okay, Harrison said, nodding as he took the list. Even from jail, people have connections to the outside world. Thank you, both of you, for your time. I'll get this to my guys, and keep you and May posted on anything that comes up. Thank you, sir, Pepper said, nodding as she walked with him to the elevator. Have they heard anything yet? MJ asked as she spoke to Ned over the phone. I just got off the phone with May, Ned said as he walked into his bedroom and closed the door behind him. They haven't yet. The chief came by her apartment and Stark Tower to ask follow-up questions earlier, but that's it. That's it? MJ asked incredulously. It's like they're not even trying to find him. Come on, you know that's not true, MJ, Ned said sadly. You heard it on the news. The guys had masks. Peter and Mr. Stark's phones were found in an alley, and the van had no license plates. It's almost as if they vanished out of thin air. MJ sighed and ran a hand through her curly hair, realizing that Ned was in fact right. Ever since news broke that Peter was kidnapped alongside his mentor and boss, Tony Stark, the police didn't stop their investigation for anything. Unfortunately, even with evidence, the video, the masked men and witnesses, it still was not enough to go off of. There was no evidence as to who was behind it, or why they did it. I know, Ned, she replied. I'm sorry.
I know, MJ, Ned replied. I'm worried about him too. I mean, I'm worried about both of them, but you know what I mean. She nodded. MJ had only known Peter since the beginning of the school year, where she had grown to like hanging out with him. He always talked about his internship with Tony Stark, and she never really minded the billionaire. Sure, he used to sell weapons, but with the arc reactor and the bath technology Peter had told her about, she saw how the billionaire was turning things around. Not only that, but Peter mentioned that Tony gave him the boost to call her, although she wasn't sure why. She sighed after another moment.
Did she say if there was a ransom or something?
She asked. The police aren't sure yet, Ned replied as he plopped on his bed with the phone. They're thinking it's one of Tony Stark's enemies.
Well, no shit, who else would it be? MJ asked. Stark's a frigging billionaire and has screwed people over before. How could someone like Peter make enemies? The most dangerous thing he did was disappear in Washington, D.C. and play hooky.
Oh, you don't know the half of it, Ned thought to himself. He couldn't help but feel grateful that Peter Parker and not Spider-Man. Everyone knew Peter Parker was not able to be around and that he was kidnapped. So May, Pepper and Happy and he wouldn't have to worry about accidentally exposing Peter as Spider-Man. However, that didn't mean the kidnappers didn't know. Why else would they take Tony Stark and his intern?
There are all kinds of theories running around, though, MJ finally said again. Some people are saying that this is all some ruse for Stark to get more money or attention or something. Others are saying this is all one huge stunt to distract everyone from something with the Avengers. Oh, and there's this one where it's part of Stark's plan to reveal Peter as his love child.
Ned scoffed. Man, people will think of anything. He replied,
Oh, yeah. And there's this one where people think it's all some plan to draw Spider-Man out.
She said. Ned couldn't help but chuckle at that, especially when he knew who Spider-Man was. Maybe we should just let the police do their job, he said.
As much as I hate the idea, you're right, MJ replied. I just hope Peter's okay, wherever they are.
I hope so too, Ned said sadly. I can have Happy bring some food over, she said as she sat down next to Happy as they ate their Chinese food.
No, it's okay, May said as she cooked in the kitchen in her apartment. I need to keep myself busy, you know. All this waiting has been driving me crazy.
Believe me, we all know the feeling, Pepper said sadly. It had been quite a few hours since they last spoke to Chief Harrison and answered his follow-up questions. They probably have to make sure everyone's addresses are accounted for.
I hope so,
May said quietly.
Oh, I hate that we have to be at home. But I also hate the idea of missing the phone if they call.
We all do, Pepper said sadly.
Another moment of silence passed over them, before Happy finally spoke up. I never should have let them go in alone, he said aloud.
What? Pepper and Mace said in unison. Happy, what are you talking about? Pepper asked after another minute of silence.
What do you mean, what am I talking about? Happy asked suddenly. Pep, I let them in there alone. I'm the head of security. I should have been there to protect them. I could have done something.
Happy, Pepper said, holding his hand to calm him down. There was nothing you could have done.
They had weapons, May added. They threatened to shoot people if Tony and Peter didn't reveal themselves, Happy. They would have killed you. But...
Happy tried to protest, only to be stopped by Pepper. No buts, Pepper suddenly said. And there had been plenty of events Tony and I had gone to where you didn't come in. Everything went fine at those events. Happy stared at Pepper and then at the phone on the table.
I know. But this is not your fault, May said firmly. And I know for a fact the last thing Tony and Peter would want to do would be blaming you. Trust me, I know my nephew.
Happy couldn't help but sigh as he ran a hand through his hair. He knew May and Pepper were right. There was no way Tony and Peter would blame him for what had happened. And that made him feel even worse. He hated the idea that they were in this mess, and
He was sitting in the tower completely helpless. I just feel so helpless, Happy said, looking at Peppa. I should be out there looking for them. I know, Peppa said, gently rubbing his back, but the police are doing whatever they can to bring them back home. I promise you, though, no one, not even Peter and Tony, blame you for this. You couldn't have possibly known that this was going to happen. She's right, Happy, May added. You're not to blame. The only one to blame is the arsehole who took them to begin with. And we won't ever stop until Tony and Peter are home safe and sound. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. Okay, so it's from the other side of things. Oh boy. I know that they have to cover things, but Peter would never run away. And, oh god, just give everyone a cuddle. I know I say it a dozen times, but come on, these people are going through some stuff right now. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.